Welcome to episode 3 of Crime and Cognition. We are going to talk a little bit today about sex addiction, if that's actually a thing, or not. Deviant or irregular sexual behavior. What term do you use normally?
Yeah, you can call it deviant or variant.
Sexual variant behavior. And we're gonna, kind of talk about those things in general, and then maybe talk a little bit about P. Diddy, Sean Combs, and his current charges he's facing in the Southern District of New York, the Manhattan Federal District Court. So, and maybe a little bit about that. We talked about it a little earlier. In fact, we were having this conversation, and I'm not sure we maybe don't agree. I don't know. I'll let you figure it out.
That happens sometimes. We don't agree on things, but we are both intellectuals.
Yeah.
And so we talk through it, and I think we're really good at sort of paraphrasing back the other's perspective, validating the other, and, kind of moving forward. Sometimes there's not always a consensus between us, and we know that that's okay.
Yeah, that's right. I think we have said to each other more than once, I totally understand where you're coming from. I'm just not in the same place,
Yeah.
And I think that might be one of the situations we end up with here. We agree on a lot, but there's some things we don't, I think. So that'll be fun, interesting to talk about. So let's open with, I guess the best thing to open with is, what is sex addiction? You hear that term a lot, sex addiction. We hear that thrown around in terms of there are real treatment centers and real, places in the United States that treat sex addiction. There are SA classes or meetings or whatever they are regularly where people go and they talk about their sex addiction, and so much like Alcoholics Anonymous or something, but related to sex. What are your thoughts? You have some very clear thoughts about this, so I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about.
Yeah, well, maybe a little bit of my background on this would be helpful for the audience. So I am a licensed psychologist, and as part of my postgraduate training, I started treating individuals with various sexual concerns, and I discovered this was something I really wanted to pursue professionally in a lot greater depth than my graduate training had offered. And so what I did was I pursued a certification as a sex therapist, and there's one governing body in the United States called the American Academy of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, and we call that ASECT for short. And they offer this certification process, which is really lengthy. It's 200 some odd hours of education, hundreds of hours of clinical experience where you are meeting with your clinical supervisor every week, and you're undergoing a tremendous amount of one-on-one supervision as well as group supervision settings on this path towards certification. And so it's a whopping process. It's not just a test. There's a practical component, and there's a lot of continuing education that goes into it. So I got my sex therapist certification a few years ago. It took me about 3 years to achieve it. So my stance on this, and almost every certified sex therapist I've ever met, their stance on this as well, is that the sex addiction model unnecessarily pathologizes people who are engaging in compulsive or sort of these out of control sexual behaviors. And the reason I say it unnecessarily pathologizes them is because there is no diagnosis for sex addiction. And you were puzzled by that.
Right, yeah, it was, because there's so much talk about sex addiction and sex addiction meetings and sex addiction treatment centers. You can Google sex addiction treatment centers and get just tons of examples all over the country run by psychologists or MDs, psychiatrists. I mean, and so what are they treating? If they're not treating sex addiction, what are they doing? When you get there, do they tell you like, never mind, you don't really have sex addiction, you got this other thing going on? I mean, how do they do that?
So they usually are using what's called a 12-step model, which is what is oftentimes used in the treatment of substance use disorders, is 12-step. There's a lot of research looking at the 12-step model, and there's some positive support. There's a lot of criticism in both the 12-step model for substance use, but particularly for the sex addiction model.
As an aside, I'd like to be clear with the audience that I went to my first AA meeting on February the something of 1986. That my first I went into alcohol and drug treatment on February 3rd of 1986, which was my sobriety birth date for the second half of my life, the second 16 and a half years of my life. And then I drank for a little while, and then now I'm again sober and not attending AA and not doing 12 steps now. It just doesn't fit my life today. But man, for 16 and a half years, that was my whole life. I was in AA meetings all the time. I sponsored people. I had sponsors. I was actively in Alcoholics Anonymous recovery and in AA for at least 10 solid years, and really active in it. So I believe, personally, anecdotally, I believe that there's some real power there. It is like anything else. You get what you put in. You get back what you put in. You get out the energy you put into it. But just as an aside, I don't want anybody to think that we're putting down on AA. My wife knows that I was sober for many years and understands and knows that I'm sober today and that I don't go to AA, but that I respect that program and what they've done for people and that kind of thing. So we're not disparaging AA in any way, shape, or form.
No, and there's no research that debunks AA.
Right.
It's just what we're looking at is recidivism. It's the how often someone starts drinking again after that.
And those numbers are crazy high in AA.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know they are. I know that from being in the rooms and watching people, me, myself included, right? I went back to drinking at some point. So.
And there's newer treatment models that are incorporating different elements of cognitive behavior therapy, affect regulation therapy, which is sort of regulating how our moods and cognitions and this kind of interplay between really just emotion regulation at its core. And so when we learn those skills, that's really helping folks.
Okay, so and I appreciate you letting me go to the side there for a moment. I just didn't want to, kind of pretend like I didn't know what AA was for sure. So back to the sex addiction units, hospitals, treatment facilities are using a 12-step model and talking about sex addiction almost like an alcohol addiction or drug addiction.
Right, but the thing about drug and alcohol addiction is there's neurobiological studies, there's neuroimaging studies looking at the parts of the brain that are involved and showing that, wow, these pleasure pathways in the brain are deeply involved in substance use disorders. That is not the case when we look at people who are engaging in excessive pornography use or who are, having a lot of sex with strangers or engaging in infidelity. And
these things may be risky, harmful, distracting from life, but they're not addictions in like a chemical drug addiction or alcohol addiction. Is that what you're saying?
That is what the current body of research suggests, is that these are not one and the same. We also don't have a diagnostic label for this. There's no consensus among researchers in the field for how to classify this. So
let's say you're a married person, male or female, married to male or female, same sex or not, or otherwise, or opposite, sex marriage, and you decide that you want to have sex outside of the marriage repeatedly without permission, and you get caught. You've done it 25 times, and you're like, oh, I'm sex addicted. What's going on there? Like, can you speak to that a little about? Because I think some people are going to say, well, what about someone that just looks at porn and masturbates 5-10 times a day or 3 times a day every day? What's going on there that's not sex addiction? What's happening there?
Well, I would want to know in what ways is it distressing to them and to their interpersonal lives? So with their spouse or their family, is it interfering with their ability to go to their job every day or perform their work successfully? And so to what degree is it distressing? if their spouse is on board with them, having intimacy outside of the relationship, then it stops becoming an issue. So we work holistically as sex therapists to understand the person within the system that they're operating in. So I wouldn't just want to see the identified patient, but I'd also want to talk to the spouse. I'd want to work with them as a dyad and understand, how is this impacting the both of them? Are they on the same page with their, erotic fantasies or urges? And do they need to talk about it and understand how to get on the same page? So I would establish what's called a sexual health plan and not pathologize things that are, erotic fantasies or urges, but rather help them harness into what fits into their life. Granted, where we're going to go is to start talking about things that are outside of, right, outside of what that couple wants together.
But I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting to point out, because it's something that we've talked about before. Because you're a sex therapist, and I have so many questions about how does this function, and one of the ones was about sex addiction, one of the questions, and I was really, I think, intrigued by an idea that you don't have to make these things bad. They're not inherently bad. It's just, is it harming you, or is it harming your relationship? Is it harming your functioning in life? And if you can make it work in there, and if it's functional, then it's not inherently terrible, right? There's I guess what I took away from that when we first talked about it, and in subsequent talks, is there are some sexual behaviors that are outside of the norm, but are also fulfilling for some people. So why not, let them do their thing, whatever their thing may be.
Now, yeah, that's such a great point. Now, if that same person, let's say it's a husband and wife, and we're talking, and she says, "No, I don't want an open marriage. This needs to be closed. I only want, monogamy," and he continues to stray, if you will, outside of the marriage. Then I think it's the point at which we say, well, what is going on that's driving these behaviors? If he's not willing to, or can't, or feels as if this is out of control for himself to stay within the confines of the sexual health plan he and his wife set up together. And so that's where we start looking at what are the, how does this person regulate their affect? When they're having a bad day, what are they doing about that? How are they controlling themselves when it comes to substance use? How are they, being mindful about their mood states, things like that.
That's great.
So that's where I would dive deeper. And that's where the problem with the AA model to treat sex addiction really comes in for me, is it says, this is what you were alluding to, you're the abuser, or you're the addicted one, and then the other person, you're the victim. And so it sets up this thing like you as the addicted person, you should be shameful about your behaviors and you should stop. And that is part of the AA model for
complete
sex addiction.
Cessation, right.
Abstinence.
Right.
So how are we teaching someone healthy sex behaviors if we tell them stop having sex altogether? There is no sexual health plan. It's just stop having sex. And then what are they learning?
Right. And then you get this thing where maybe they successfully stop, but then this part of their life that there's some purpose for, some reason, some things leading to this are sort of ignored and sort of fester or grow. And that's
it's the same thing with eating disorders. We don't tell someone to just, if they're, binge eating, for example, we don't say stop eating. Right. We all have to eat. They have to learn how to eat healthy. Right. It's the same thing with sex and the sexual dysfunction or out of control sex behaviors. It's creating a sexual health plan. So that's really an area that I specialize in, and I love working within that, because people feel so liberated when they come and they say, okay, I'm not like a porn addict. No.
Right. I think the first reaction I would have if I felt that way was be like, I'm not broken. That's awesome. Like, oh man, I'm not broken. Like I just have some bad behavior that I need to correct, or I need to course correct in what I'm doing. I'm not a broken person. I'm not a throwaway person because I'm doing this behavior. I'm having this behavior outside of the norm. Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, and here's the thing we want to talk about: we sort of transition from what is a sort of sometimes personally harmful in relationships, but not society harmful. But right. There are some out of control, deviant, off the mark sexual behaviors that become societal harmful and are in fact addressed in the penal code, addressed in the criminal code in just about every state and in the federal court, obviously, right? And those include anything having to do with a person under 18, or anything having to do. Often, a lot of states have laws against sex work, and if you exchange money for a sex act, in a lot of states that's a criminal law. That's a criminal act, right? And so those are the kind of things that are interesting to talk about, and I'm sure you've come into contact with some of that as well in your forensic work. It's an interesting overlap, right? People who are in the forensic work and have done some of that, and you've been able to talk to those people in that environment, right? I mean, you've been able to have you done some forensic analysis of persons who have been involved in some of that out of control and been charged for this out of control sexual behavior?
Yes, both research-wise, both my master's thesis and my doctoral dissertation, the central focus was on adolescents who engaged in sex offending behaviors.
Okay.
And then I went on to have a lot of training in juvenile detention facilities and then in jails for the assessment of sex offenders.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so
you've done a lot of work with that.
I did a lot initially in my career, and that's an area that I'm really not as interested in these days. I would say I'm interested in the quote-unquote lighter side of sexuality. That's where we started the conversation.
Right,
Believe it or not, that would be the out-of-control sex behaviors,
right.
Is what I would say sort of the lighter side of things. But yeah, there's a lot of anomalous sex behaviors out there where there's a violation of the rights of someone else, or there's a violation of an individual who cannot give consent for one reason or another.
Right.
They're intellectually disabled. They're under the influence of drugs and alcohol. They're too young. They're
right.
developmentally.
Of a tender age and can't.
They're of a
make
tender
it,
age.
Right. Can't
That's
make
a legal
that
term, right?
It is. In fact, it is. Yes, yes, that is in fact a legal term. So let's pivot a little. Talk about P. Diddy, right? Sean Combs, and we've been talking about this in our house because it's a very interesting case, and it's big news, of course. But also just from a criminal defense attorney's perspective, and from a forensic psychologist perspective with so much background in sex therapy and being a certified sex therapist, his allegations are surrounding sexual behavior. The allegations are surrounding sexual behavior, or the central feature or component of these alleged crimes is sexual behavior.
Yeah, can you help us, me and the listeners, understand what's going on with this case? Sure. Because there's so much, this is really salacious. There's so much out there. And I asked you, I said, can you really get a little more granular on a legal level? What did you find? What did your research turn up?
So it's interesting. He's been charged with racketeering conspiracy.
Okay, what is that?
I know this is a very difficult thing to wrap your head around. It's essentially that he runs an enterprise, and he's the head of that enterprise, and that enterprise is its focus is quasi-legal and quasi-illegal, right? That there can be a large legal component to his enterprise, and there clearly is, right? He's got this massive legitimate business. But then there's an allegation by the federal government that part of this business, part of this enterprise, because of its employees and the people that worked for him and were paid by the enterprise, were engaging in or assisting in some of this out of control sexual behavior, right? We'll call it that for the moment. And in this conspiracy, this charge, this racketeering charge, the government has to allege that there's an enterprise. And I don't do a lot of racketeering cases, so excuse me if I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong. But the government has to show that there's an enterprise, that he's the head of and or has some controlling part of the enterprise, and that the enterprise itself has conducted criminal activity across state lines. So there's a couple of components, and I think there might even be something else, but I'm less interested in this racketeering charge than I am the sort of the granular other charges, the interior charges, because for the racketeering charge to be brought, there has to be some specific criminal acts by the enterprise, and those are count one is the racketeering charge. Count two is sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion. So sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion. Count 3 is transportation to engage in prostitution. So that's the interstate transportation of persons to engage in prostitution. And those are the counts, right? And the counts are in the racketeering charge are multiple acts. And this is, I'm reading from the actual indictment that's been filed. It's a public document. It was filed under seal at first, and then there's an order unsealing this indictment. So I'm not giving you anything that's not public information. This is a publicly filed document. Multiple acts involving kidnapping, chargeable under the following provisions of state law, and then they quote some California state law. Multiple acts involving, strange enough, it's multiple acts involving arson, but there isn't any factual allegation of arson in the indictment that I saw, and it was a pretty quick reading. I haven't, sort of worried about, but I didn't see any acts of arson. I thought that was very strange. That may be a crime that was previously charged in California, and the government's trying to bring that in to their racketeering indictment because it was previously charged. That's probably what that is.
So they're just saying, we're going to add this on too?
Well, and then multiple acts involving bribery. So my sense about this, because it's California Penal Code stuff, is that he may have been charged and convicted of these matters in California. And those underlying charges that were done previously while he ran this enterprise are being sort of brought into the racketeering conspiracy to show that he's committed crimes in multiple jurisdictions over a period of time. And I believe that's what this is. But again, I don't know. I'm not that familiar with this. I haven't looked up his California Penal Code record, so I'm not sure about that. The acts under Title 18 United States Code 1512, multiple acts relating to tampering with a witness. Okay. 18 USC 1589 relating to forced labor. That's the coercive paying of people for the prostitution. 1591 relating to sex trafficking, bringing people over state lines for the purpose of sex acts, or illegal sex acts, that is. And then multiple acts indictable under Title 18 USC 2421 and 22 related to transportation and inducement to travel for purposes of prostitution or other illegal sexual activities. And then there are some drug charges. And the drug charges, I assume, are the least of his worries at this point, right?
So what is your kind of bird's eye view of this? What is your take home when you read through this? What's your gut tell you?
I think the government has some problems. I really do. I think the government has some problems. I think that they're using the government has to make some assertions that there were threats of serious harm, okay, against the people who were participating in these acts, right? So it was sex parties called freak-offs.
Allegedly.
No, there's like video and the thing. I mean, it's pretty obvious that these were happening.
Okay.
So this isn't allegedly. This is pretty obvious.
This term, incontrovertible proof.
That's pretty obvious it was happening.
On.
There's some videos and such. I don't think that they've made this up. These things were happening.
Okay.
And apparently some members of his enterprise, so employees, people he was paying, and people that he was, supporting or whatever the case may be, they had a financial relationship and they were working for him, whether or not they were on payroll or not. No idea. But it's unnecessary. The fact of the matter is that they were involved in the enterprise. We're bringing people, women, essentially is what the indictment says. And this is all public information coming from the indictment, to be clear. Bringing women to hotels who were then asked to, or as the government says, coerced to engage in sex acts with male sex workers, which I found interesting, right? So bringing these females in for these performative, and that's the government's word, performative sex acts where P. Diddy would watch, or his friends would watch, these sex acts occurring with these sex workers. And the government's contention is that A, the sex act themselves were illegal, so bringing them across state lines to do this was illegal. B, that they were coerced in some way, either financially, and this is the government saying this, either financially or through some kind of reputation gain or gain of, being employed by him or being on a show or whatever, like giving some money to them. And the problem is that this coercion is actually, the term coercion in the law says it means threat of serious harm or physical restraint. Any scheme or pattern intended to cause a person to believe that failure to perform an act would result in serious harm. or physical restraint against any person, or the abused or threatened abuse of law or legal process. They didn't assert anything in that. So it's the serious harm part, right? And then you have to ask yourself, well, if coercion requires serious, and this is the legal analysis, right? This is what lawyers do. This is what we do all day long, right? So if they say he's coerced these people, and coercion requires serious harm, well, what's the serious harm? So then you go down to the law, and it says the term serious harm means any harm, whether physical or non-physical, including psychological, financial, or reputational harm that is sufficiently serious under all surrounding circumstances to compel a reasonable person of the same background and the same circumstances to perform or to continue performing commercial sexual activity in order to avoid incurring that harm. So you keep doing the sex thing, or you're going to be harmed. Serious harm, serious psychological, financial, or reputational harm.
Okay. So what are you taking issue with?
So my issue is that, let's say I'm a young lady, and I hear that P. Diddy Combs is throwing this party, and it's going to be fun, and it might be some sex and stuff. I mean, it might be some wild stuff. It's called a freak off, so everybody knows what that means. And
I like how your Louisiana boy comes out.
well, I'm just saying, look, they're going to give me some money, and I'm going to go. And if I'm chill with it and I'm having a great time, then I'm going to get some more money. Well, I mean, what's the harm? Okay, let's say I'll give you $500 to come and to this party. Okay, cool. I'm going to fly you to this place. It's going to be a great time. You go to the party, and then, now here's the coercion part, right? We want you to perform this sex act, and if you do, I'll give you another $1,000. Well, what's the serious harm in that? It's just more money.
What if he's saying you can't leave? Would that be kidnapping?
Well, that is, in fact, this part that says physical restraint against any person. That's a problem. That's a serious problem.
So we don't know if that occurred.
If somebody's standing at the door and says, you can't go unless you do this, that's a major league problem, okay? But that's not the kind of coercion that at least I read in the indictment. And again, I don't have the evidence in front of me. I don't have the facts. But I think that's a stretch too, right? That's a long way to go. There's 10, 15, 20 people there. Male sex workers, females, everybody's involved, and suddenly you can't leave?
Okay, so...
Doesn't it beg the question that if you're P. Diddy and you're chilling and you got all these people and this one person wants to leave, you'd be like, all right, deuces. Like, bye.
We got all these others.
We got 13 other people over here. Like, I don't, you know what I mean? Like, it sort of, I don't know, it doesn't pass, we say in the legal term, it doesn't pass the smell test. Like, that doesn't really sound like...
Okay, well, let me hit on a different part of what's in this definition of coercion, which is the psychological part. I immediately think about the power dynamic and the power differential, where there's this insanely wealthy person who's giving people money, and we don't know what their financial backgrounds are, right? Is it manipulative to the degree where there is psychological harm to someone, if they're being, given, I don't know how much money, but how much money would it take for someone to stay and do these acts? Yeah,
the man could give us life-changing money and never miss it, right? It's pocket change, right? He's that wealthy. He's mega billionaire rich, right? And so, sure, but I guess my question is, and I get it. I'm not in any way am I saying that kind of power and coercion is ethical or moral. I'm not saying that enticing someone to do these things is moral or ethical under any circumstance. What I'm talking about is strictly, is this criminal? Is this a criminal act, and should this man suffer criminal consequences based on this? And hey, I'll give you $100,000 if you stay. Well, man, that might change some people's lives, right? That's like winning the lottery for some folks. Like, oh, what? I'll give you $10 million. That's a life changer. It changed your life, probably changed your family's life, your brother, your parents, your sister, your kids. That's a life-changing amount of money, right? But how much money does it have to be to surpass merely enticing someone in a way that is, I will accentuate and positively affect your life if you do this interesting and fun thing? You don't have to, though. What if any offer was followed by, but it's up to you. You can jet if you want. Well, now, you get, I just think the government's going to have some trouble, right, with this what I suspect that victim one, and this is absolute conjecture, but this is what criminal defense attorneys do. I suspect victim one had some buyer's remorse. Didn't get what he or she wanted out of the situation, or went and participated and left and got the guilty feeling. It's like, oh, I didn't like that. That didn't feel good. I think I'm going to complain. I'm not saying that that person doesn't have a right to not feel good about it. I'm not saying that that person doesn't have a right to have regret in life. I mean, goodness gracious, we all have regret, right? We've all done some things we're like, ooh, really wish I wouldn't have done that. But does that rise to the level of criminal coerciveness and a threat of serious harm?
I think a lot of people out there, myself included, are also wondering, well, if all of this is able to be minimized so much, potentially, why is he, being, why was bail taken off the table? Why is he,
it's a great question.
in such hot water?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will tell you that the bail obligation and the making of bail in the federal system is the one serious consideration of that in the federal system. In fact, the paramount consideration is whether or not the defendant will return to court. Societal harm, that he's going to go out and harm someone or that something's going to happen, is also a consideration. And a person with an enormous amount of money has the ability to harm, right? I mean, we know that. But, there have been some billionaires who've faced recent criminal charges and have been released, who had billions of dollars and tremendous power and millions upon millions and millions of followers that would do whatever he wanted them to do. And he was released. And so you'd have to ask yourself the question, well, why is Sean Combs not released? Why is P. Diddy still in jail? And there's this danger that he'll flee the country, right? They've taken his passport. That's part of federal being arrested in the federal court is turn over your passport. There's no chance of being released without turning over your passport. But then there's this idea that he still has so much money and so much resources that he could just disappear. But to where? I mean, he's doggone Sean Combs. I mean, he's just going to blend in somewhere with an entourage and billions of dollars. That kind of begs the question, right? It's kind of silly. So I think his attorneys, in fact, what I've seen is that they're challenging the bond, non-setting of the bond. I think they're going to be pretty aggressive about that, given the fact that he may have some criminal history, and that's also considered, obviously, right? His acts, previous criminal acts. But the fact that is he going to be currently harmful to people, I think is a lesser of a question, because it doesn't. I mean, how foolish would he be to get himself in further hot water? I think the question really has been will he return to court?
And how do you foresee this unfolding in terms of a timeline? Are these things usually drag on and on? What is your estimation of that?
Well, the court suspended the Speedy Trial Act. So in the federal court, from the date of arrest to the date of trial is 72 days under the Speedy Trial Act, unless the case is determined to be complex. Now, this could be determined to be complex, but that motion hasn't been filed yet. And the Speedy Trial clock has been suspended from September 24th to, I think, sometime in October, the end of October perhaps, which I think is the next court date. The courts specifically addressed that time won't be included in the 72-day speedy trial clock. So the federal court system doesn't like state. You are familiar with state courts. You know how long it takes me to try some cases in a year, 2 years, sometimes 3 years down the road, and we're still waiting to go to trial in a case. In the federal court, it's much, much faster, and especially the Southern District of New York. It's a very fast docket. They don't sort of delay unreasonably there. It's time to go to trial. It's time to go. So,
yeah, I have a case in Louisiana that still is 5 years.
Yeah. I have a 7-year-old murder case that was set to go to trial in 2 weeks and has been continued already to next year. So these kind of things occur. I mean, it certainly happen, and oftentimes it happens. My defendant is out, so is everybody else in my particular case. So these people aren't suffering by sitting in jail. And frankly, that's part of the consideration, right? If the government would come and say, this is a complex case, Judge, and we need more than 72 days to bring it to trial, we're going to need 6 months or 9 months. Now, there is a presumption that the person should be released because the government can't bring the case fast enough, right? So his release, the presumption of his release will even be increased at that time, because the government, the court, rightly will say, well, look, if you don't have the evidence ready to bring this case, then why should he wait on the government? Why should he wait on you sitting in the jail? So I don't think the government's going to move to slow this down very much. I think they're going to move pretty fast. I don't think this will take a whole lot of time, but it's Sean Combs. They'll probably file hundreds of documents, pretrial documents, in between now and when the trial occurs, whenever it does occur. So it could get very lengthy. But with him in jail, that's the wild card, right? If he's determined to be released, or a set of conditions upon which he can be released and still be safe, an ankle monitor perhaps, a home incarceration in a certain home. I mean, there's been some pretty famous musicians with tremendous amounts of money. I mean, the difference between having 100 million and 5 billion is, there's no difference, right, in terms of being able to flee the country. There have been some pretty famous musicians and famous people who've been arrested and released under conditions. Home incarceration in a particular home with an ankle monitor. You can't go anywhere. I think Sean Combs will probably be released under those conditions at some point. And because I don't think the trial's going to go to, I think his defense attorneys will work to delay the trial in every way they possibly can in order to get him released, right? It's a bit of the functional defense is file these motions, challenge the government, get him released. Let him go home and work on his own defense and assist his attorneys in his defense, other than sitting in a jail, right? And that's part of why we want people released. So it's interesting. This is an interesting case, and I guess part of what I would ask you is, what's your thought about the sex worker thing? I mean, here's a good hypothetical for you. Let's say some guys get together and they decide they want to hire a sex worker because one of them's getting married. And that sex worker comes over, and maybe two of them, and they make a performative sex act in front of those men. Does it matter if one of them's a billionaire? Does it matter if it's 10 people performing the sex act instead of 2? Does it matter that they drove in from another state or flew in from another state? I mean, what are your thoughts about that? And I'm kind of playing law school with you, and kind of playing, these intuition, sort of intuitive kind of thoughts process. But what is your thought about, I mean, I know your stance on sex work. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, I would look at this from a clinical lens. Is everybody a consenting adult? Can these sex workers consent to this? Okay. Are they under the influence of anything? Is there something going on where there's, the potential for, some kind of a, adverse event that would really negatively impact either party there.
Right. What if they gave consent, even so far as to say, here's the list of things we will do. I consent to these 10 things, and those are the only 10 things that are happened. But subsequent to that consent, they get high as possible, like totally messed up. Even in a state where you wouldn't normally think they would give consent, but you could look at the consent document and be like, but I got this consent document beforehand, so it's all good. Do you think that vitiates consent, or is that still consent?
They can then no longer consent to what they previously consented to.
Oh, okay. So despite the fact that they'd given previous consent, the intoxication...
They're not of sound mind anymore.
Oh, that's interesting. Does it follow that every person that gets really hammered, two people get together, they're ready to go, let's go to the house and have sex. Okay, and they get there and they drink a ton, they get super drunk and they have sex. Did they both enter into a non-consensual sexual act?
That's pretty morally ambiguous.
I'll play this game, right? I'll play this game of thought process of, because essentially what I'm getting at is, if all of these people were willing participants in this performative sex act, what is the problem? We're talking about adults, we're talking about people who are sex workers and make money, know what they're doing. They've agreed to the performative sex act with each other. They go and they have this performative sex act for a day or 2 days or 3 days, and they make what I suspect to be a tremendous amount of money. And then they go about their business.
Yeah, I'm taking issue with all the drugs and alcohol that's supplied to them.
Yeah.
In my mind, that is altering your mental state. It's altering your capacity to give informed consent about what you had previously consented to, and then, what it is that you're doing in the present.
But if we criminalize people entering sex acts outside of a sound mind, You know, yes, I entered that sex act, but you know what? After I agreed to it and we were doing the thing, man, I realized I was getting more drunk because I did 5 shots before I left the bar. And I realized I was, you know, the ramp up of intoxication was happening, and I kind of don't even remember it. So suddenly, are those people criminals? I mean, they might be, it might be stupid, but is it a criminal act? And I think that's the sort of thing where I begin to talk, where I begin to see the government's case as being a little bit weak. And let me tell you what else I think is an indication of the weakness of the government's case. There's been a lot of publicity, and there's been a lot of salacious publicity. Oh, these freak-offs and sex parties and this performative sex act and this stuff. It's like when you start to talk about sex acts and sex work and start to talk about a sex party with multiple participants, suddenly there becomes this immoral kind of judgment that this is immoral, you know. And, you know, there's that interesting adage in the law that says, if the law's on your side, pound the law. If the facts are on your side, pound the facts. And if neither of them are on your side, pound the table. It seems like the government's pounding the table. They're making a lot of noise. And maybe because it's Sean Combs, and maybe because he's super billionaire, and maybe because it's just, the news is just eating it up. But, you know, I know that right after the indictment, a video from 2016 was released on CNN at the Hotel Intercontinental in Los Angeles. Well, where did that come from? Like that just came out of the blue. All of a sudden, that just showed up. Well, like, where are these things coming from? And to me, if the government's putting out that kind of information, then the red flag goes off in my head and says, well, how really strong is their case? Are they trying to win this in the case of public opinion as opposed to the courtroom?
Well, this is a case that we should follow.
Yeah.
And I think as this unfolds right now, we're offering a lot of speculation. And
I don't have a lot of information.
we're citing what the indictment says. And as this unfolds, we'll revisit it and we'll talk about what you notice is happening in the courtroom, what kind of defense they're putting on. I think this is a really great case for us to continue to discuss as it unfolds.
Yeah, I'm going to pay attention, I think. I think that's a really great idea. You know, we'll watch the public filings and the public news, and then maybe we can come back to this at some point and talk about it a little more.
Yeah.
Because I want to, you know, I think my sense about it right now, if I were to say my sense about this case, is that Sean Combs was engaged in a lot of out of the norm sexual behavior. But all of it was not criminal. And the government's asserting that some of it was. Actually, the government's asserting that all of it was. But it all can't be. I just don't believe that to be the case. Some of it may have been. There may have been some moments where there was some real coercion or some real stopping of someone leaving or something like that. That may come out. But I just don't think the case is as strong as the government has put out, as strong as the public seems to believe it is right now.
Well, I'm going to love if there are some forensic psychologists that are evaluating some of these, alleged victims or alleged survivors. I am going to be very interested in more coverage of this. So
Me too.
I think that's probably a good time for us to wrap this up.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you all for coming by, and stay tuned. We're going to cover some more of this case and others, and continue our podcast, continue talking about legal issues and forensic science, forensic psychology issues as we go forward. Thank you.